If you want to understand the war, you need to look out at the war in this part of the country, not Virginia, because this is where the Confederacy lost the war. I'm Richard McMurry. I was born and grew up in Atlanta, went to school in Atlanta and Decatur, then went off to the Virginia Military Institute. I decided when I was at VMI, sometime in my third class or sophomore year, that I wanted to teach history and that I wanted to work in the field of Civil War history. And several of the VMI professors suggested that I go to Emory University and study with Bell Wiley, which was one of the great experiences of my life. My mother was born here in Cobb County, grew up here in a house that was General Hardee's headquarters in June 1864, and my interest in the Civil War grew out of that. If you're familiar with Marietta, it's right behind the Marietta High School.
Okay, I've probably seen it then. Okay, and so how old were you? It sounds like quite many years, in that house. Did you find anything? Did you find?
You're very tactful about that. I'm 87 years old.
Yeah, so, did you find the lost Confederate gold in there by chance?
No, alas, I couldn't find the lost Confederate gold, but we could find many balls. The house is east of Cheatham's Hill, and a lot of the artillery and infantry projectiles that the Federal soldiers fired at the Confederates on that ridge that runs north-south, and part of which is Cheatham's Hill, went over the ridge and landed in the fields around the house. And of course, we found nothing like was there when my mother was growing up. They'd plow the fields every year and turn up cannonballs. I still have several. Belt buckles, Georgia Military Institute button off a uniform. So, as I say, I had a long association with the war and in general, and with the war in this area in particular. And when I was at VMI and decided I wanted to go to graduate school, several of the professors said, go to Emory, you can write about the Atlanta campaign, and it's just natural. At that time, the only book, not counting Gone with the Wind, the only book on the Atlanta campaign was a little volume published in 1882 by Jacob D. Cox, who was a Union general and fought in the Atlanta campaign. It was part of a series issued in the 1880s by Scribners. And as I say, it was just a wide open field because other than Gone with the Wind and Cox, there was no book on the Atlanta campaign. And I still think that that Gone with the Wind was the best researched book on the Atlanta campaign before 1965. So it was a wide open area for research and writing. I had a number of friends in high school who were also very much interested in the war. And I can remember once we got to where we could drive on our own, we would sometimes have what we would call expeditions from Decatur, where we were living, up to Kennesaw Mountain, down to Andersonville, around to Chickamauga, into other sites. And of course, once I was at VMI and in Virginia, there were almost hundreds of sites up there that you could visit. So we spent a lot of time at it. It was, as I say, a great deal of fun, and you learn an awful lot.
Right, and so when would you say this was? Is this before the centennial of the Civil War? Was it after?
Before the centennial, during the centennial, and after the centennial. Gotcha. With the 2 years out that I was in the Army. Right. Although even then, since I was stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky, Tennessee, it's called Fort Campbell, Kentucky, because most of the post office is in Kentucky. State line runs right through the post office. And once I got a car, I could go around, visit sites like Fort Donaldson, Shiloh, Perryville, Mill Springs, a number of other sites in the Kentucky, Tennessee area, which I enjoyed doing very much on weekends and sometimes when I would take a few days leave.
Gotcha. And so it sounds like you've got history with that.
I got infected with it pretty early.
Pretty early on. So in your, I mean, this might be a tough question to ask, but just while you were in Georgia, you know, growing up, and you were going on those expeditions with your friends, and then when you were in Virginia, and then when you're, you know, stationed at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, out of those three respective places, did you have a certain historic site or Civil War battlefield that you were like, this is like my favorite one, this is the best resource for me to kind of find stuff and do a lot of research at? Or
at that time, the serious research I was doing was actually in my room in the BOQ at Bachelor Officers' Quarters at Fort Campbell. I couldn't afford a car. The first year and a half, year and a half, 19, 20 months I was in the Army. So I was stuck in the BOQ on weekends. And I probably read every book in the Fort, the Fort Campbell Library that related to the war. And I had a number of them myself by then. You ask about a favorite battle. I really didn't have one at that time. I have since become fascinated more by the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee than by any other. Mostly, I think, because of the interest I have in General Patrick Cleburne. And also, I decided that of the battlefields, the one I like to visit most is probably Shiloh. It's, I think, easily the most beautiful of all the battlefield parks. And there's a wonderful catfish place to eat right outside the park. It's only a few miles downriver and on the same side of the river from the battlefield park. Mm-hmm. But if you go there, go in the spring when it's beautiful.
Gotcha. And at this, so when you're studying all this, I mean, how many books were there on Shiloh? That Shelby Foote wrote his?
I believe he had. There were a couple of old books on Shiloh. But the really good books by people like Larry Daniel had not been written. If you look at the Western theater in the Civil War, there was really very little interest in it before the centennial, which I think created a great distortion in understanding the war. And it's only been since 1965 that we've begun to get a number of really good books about the battlefields in Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, Georgia, in the Western theater.
And why do you think that is? Is it just because of the romanticism of Grant versus Lee? Is it all of that?
Well, it's to a large extent it is that. It's also the fact that those battles in Virginia were fought near the population center. This was a rural area, and there were relatively few people who lived out here. The distances were great from one battlefield to another. You know, you can go in Virginia from, you know, the wilderness to Spotsylvania to Manassas to Antietam to the Richmond battlefield. Very short drives. You can't do that out here. You know, the distance from Chattanooga to Atlanta is the distance from Washington to Richmond. And when you go from Chattanooga to Atlanta, you haven't even done half of the 1864 campaign in Georgia. I have a friend from Australia where there was, and I hope still is, a Civil War roundtable. And he visited here, and he said, things in Virginia are so close. And he'd come out here, and you'd do maybe one battlefield, then you'd have a day of driving to get to the next one. And I have always argued that that's why the war out here was more important militarily than the war in Virginia. but people concentrate on the war in Virginia. So, I think, as I said, before 1965, there was very little written on what took place out here.
Gotcha. And so for you in your life, when so you went to VMI, so, and that's where a lot of the generals, that's where they also went, right?
Well, there were 425 Confederate generals, and about 17 or 18 of them were VMI graduates. And most of them were not graduates of military schools. The really high-ranking ones usually were. All the full generals, all but, I believe, 2 of the lieutenant generals, and most of the major generals. And the VMI, 3 major generals, and I believe 14 brigadier generals out of the 425.
Gotcha. And when you were going there, I mean, was that something that you took note of, and that the school was like, yeah, we've had these generals go through, and was there one in particular that you were like, oh yeah, it's cool that I'm going to the same school that he went to?
No, but it's the same school that Stonewall Jackson taught at.
And so, like, did they keep a lot of mementos from that? Like, is it like, this is the classroom where did they say, like, he taught right here, that kind of thing? Or
when he was there, the classrooms were in what is now the barracks. You go to VMI, there's a part of the barracks that's very old, goes back to the 1850s. And Jackson actually lived in that for a while. And what they call section rooms. Academic classes were organized in sections. And I was in a section of history majors. And by the time I was there, they had separate academic buildings. But in Jackson's day, the sections met in some large rooms in barracks. So the school, the old part of the school does have that. And there was the statue of Jackson. We had to salute it every time we came out of the arch where it stood, although he was facing away from the arch, and the joke was, what exactly are we saluting? So the statue has since been moved. It's been taken up to the Newmarket battlefield, several miles down the Shenandoah Valley.
So would you say that there's even though you guys are separated by, however many years, like, would you say there's a certain connection that you feel like you have with Stonewall Jackson? I mean, was he like somebody, when you saw him pop up in, the books that you were reading at the time, was that something that you were like, I'm in the same area that he was in, and I'm sharing kind of the same atmospheres, I guess, is what I'm trying to say?
No, not really with Jackson. With Lee, it was somewhat more that way, because Washington and Lee is right next to VMI. Literally, they're like that. And the Lee Chapel, where he and a number of members of his family are buried, when we walk by the Lee Chapel, we salute him. And the house he lived in is there. Traveler, his horse, is buried there. People would put apples on Traveler's grave. It was much more so with Lee. Lee was the kind of person that you saw, apparently, you read this, people saw Lee and they were just in awe. I mean, he was that kind of man. I read an entry in a memoir written by a Mississippi veteran 50 years after the war. He saw Robert E. Lee once in 4 years in the Army of Northern Virginia, and only when he happened to march by a house and Lee was on the porch. And he never forgot it. Said it was the most awesome thing I'd ever seen. So Lee was much more that way than Jackson. What was it the woman said? I've only heard of God, but I've seen General Lee.
And what do you, and just, I mean, how do you chunk that up? I mean, why, I guess my question is, why were people so, I mean, because he was really the general, like even before the Civil War, you know, I mean, you hear it through history classes where, he was offered, hey, they offered to him, hey, be our guy for, the Union side. And he says, I have to stay with, Virginia. That's my, and so is that what it is? I mean, how much, I guess what I'm trying to ask is like, why were people so in awe, just even at the time, and then how much it's grown just over these, however many years it's been since the Civil War. It's just, Lee is that, why, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
I don't know why. I tell people there were 4 men in American history who were that way. One of them was George Washington. I keep thinking back to some European visitor said, I never knew the meaning of the word majesty until I saw Washington. In case you're interested, the other 2 besides Washington and Lee were George Marshall, the chief of staff in World War II, and Bear Bryant, the football coach in Alabama.
Gotcha. And
I don't know. I don't know why.
It's just something.
It's just the way they are.
And then correct me if I'm wrong here, but aren't Lee and Washington, there's relation there because it's only like 100, less than 100 years that separate them, right?
Lee married George Washington's step-granddaughter, Mary Custis. She was living in Arlington House, which is now in the National Cemetery, and her father, George Washington Parke Custis, had a lot of Washington heirlooms. And Lee, in fact, more or less consciously modeled himself on Washington. Washington acted that way probably because that was the way you were expected to act if you were in the 18th century and a member of what was called the better sort of people, which I think Washington clearly was. It's a quality within the person, not so much the exterior. The quality in the person produces the aura, if you want to call it that gives the person that whatever you want to call it,
yeah, the aura.
That wins that kind of respect, if you can, more than respect, but you could call it that. Tom Conley, the historian, maintained that this attitude toward Lee was post-war, when post-war Southerners canonized Lee and deified Lee, but it's not. It goes back before the war. You can find any number of people before the war who had complimentary things to say about Lee. That his appearance, his character, his intelligence, his decency, his honesty, and the argument against Conley is just overwhelming.
Gotcha. And just, I think this might be the last one I've got on Lee, but just Lee, I mean, like later on in his life, he's in Savannah, Georgia, right? Didn't he get sent there for his health to kind of,
Lee?
Lee.
Well, he was in Savannah 3 times that I can recall right offhand. Right out of West Point, he was assigned to work on the construction of Fort Pulaski. And he was there a year or 2. He was there in the 1861-62 when he was commanding the South Atlantic Confederate forces on the coast, Charleston, Savannah, Jacksonville, on down South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. And he came there in 1870 for a few days to visit his father's grave, which was on Cumberland Island, which, as you probably know, is off the Georgia coast, right at the border between Georgia and Florida. And Lee's father had been in the West Indies, was returning to America, died en route, and the body was taken ashore and buried on Cumberland Island. Later it was moved to Lexington, Virginia, and is in the Lee Chapel now. That was just a few months before he died.
the gentleman you studied under Emory,
Bell Wiley.
Bell Wiley. Talk to me about just meeting him, for the first time, and then eventually studying, underneath him. Tell me just some of the things you learned, and just kind of the just whatever you got.
Most of them I
Hey,
can't
understand.
be
I see.
disgusting.
I gotcha.
Some of his expressions were, Wiley taught at Emory beginning in the late 1940s. He had earlier taught at Ole Miss and LSU and elsewhere. His strength was that he was interested not so much in the great figures of history as in the common folk. And he wrote 3 extremely important books. The first one was in the early 1930s. It's called Southern Negroes, 1861, 1865. It's one of the first really sympathetic works about Black Americans by a really distinguished white historian. And then he wrote a book in the early 1940s called Johnny Reb. It's a collective biography of the enlisted Confederate soldier, and he wrote a book that was published in the early 1950s on Billy Yank, which is the same thing for the Union soldiers. And in between all of that, he was involved in World War II in the Office of Military History. By the time I was interested in it, I graduated from VMI in 1961. So Wiley was already established as one of the great Civil War historians in the U.S. He was on the Civil War Centennial Commission. And it was just a real pleasure and a privilege to study with him in graduate school. I had the good fortune of being his teaching assistant. He taught a class every spring on the history of the South that had an enrollment around 140, 150 students. And for 3 of the 4 years that I was at Emory, I was his assistant, which meant gopher, flunky, chambermaid, orderly, do anything, go to the airport and do. Well, he had a friend come in one time, and you can guess who was the guy was from Italy, and you can guess who was assigned to drive out to the airport, pick him up, and drive him back to Emory. Yes, sir, Dr. Wiley, right off the bat. So there I go. I would have been the teaching assistant the 4th year, except he was invited to teach at Oxford University in England that year. I tried to get him to take me with him, but he wouldn't do it. And after he retired, he taught at Agnes Scott. I said, don't you need a teaching assistant at that all-girls school? But he wouldn't take me there. So, but it was a really great privilege just to know him and to work with him. People say he was pompous. Yes, he was, but he had a lot to be pompous about.
That's fair. And so, so before you ever met him and he became his assistant, did you, like, when you were studying at VMI, did you read any of his, was that when you were first introduced to his works, or did you just?
No, I probably read some of the stuff he wrote in various magazines. He was a person who thought history should not be confined to the history departments. There are a lot of pompous gas bags on university faculties, and they don't want anything to do with average people. Wiley wasn't that way. And he was very much, go out. Well, for example, a lot of people, professional historians, will not speak to Civil War roundtables or do things like that. Wiley did. He made a point of speaking to Civil War roundtables all over the country. And it's a great experience. I've done it myself and really enjoy it. But when I was at VMI, the Civil War historian there was John Barrett, who had written several fine books on the Civil War in North Carolina. And he was really the one that said, you're interested in this, you're from the Atlanta area, you ought to go to Emory and study with Bell Wiley. And there I am.
And the rest is history, as I say. So you mentioned that, you know, Dr. Wiley was on the Centennial Commission. We mentioned, and we talked about Centennial earlier. Talk to me as a country, like how big of a deal was that for the country, and just kind of what did that entail, if you don't mind?
How big a deal was what?
The Centennial, just the celebration of that. Like what did all that entail? I mean, he was on the commission, so was there like a grand ceremony in Virginia, or was it just kind of like nationwide, or was it isolated to just like kind of the East Coast?
There was a National Civil War Centennial Commission chaired by Allen Nevins, who is probably the greatest of American historians, at least the author of the article about him in the Dictionary of Literary Biography says he was. And since I wrote it, obviously that's true. It had people from around the country. I believe Wiley was the only Southerner on the commission. I'm not certain of that, but I think that's true. And they sponsored studies of various aspects. And there was a state Centennial Commission in each of the states. Well, I can't say each of them. I don't know whether Idaho had a Civil War Centennial Commission or not, but a lot of the states did. And they would sponsor similar things at the state and local level. There were groups that got involved in reenactments, and it was, in that sense, a big deal. And it stirred up a lot of popular interest. Interest in the war, you know, it goes up and down and up and down. It went up in the Centennial and went down after that. Ken Burns' series on public television goes up and down. And then you get to the 150th anniversary, it goes up and down. And I hope it'll keep doing that for at least another 5 or 6 years, after which it won't bother me anymore. When the centennial happened, if you date it from 1961 to 65, 61, 62, and most of 63, I was in the Army. And then when I got out of the Army in 63, I was in graduate school until 67. So I was at Fort Campbell and Emory during the centennial. The Centennial Commission met in Atlanta in 1964 on the anniversary of the Battle of Atlanta. And Wiley took his graduate students to some of the meetings, and again, that was a great experience. That's when I met Allen Nevins and a number of others.
Gotcha. Okay. So you being, just a renowned author when it comes to like everything you mentioned, having those seeds planted, like you should write on, Atlanta campaign. When did you say, you know what, I should probably write a book? When was the first time you had that thought? And then talk to me about the process of doing your first book.
Well, when you're in graduate school, you write what is called a thesis, a master's thesis. And I wrote mine on the battle at Kennesaw Mountain. And then when you're working on a PhD, you write a dissertation, which is in essence a book. I wrote mine on the first part of the Atlanta campaign when Joseph E. Johnston was in command. It's like writing any kind of paper except there's more of it. And I did have the advantage of all those months at Fort Campbell when I was stuck in the BOQ and reading everything I could get. Because once the football season was over, there was not much else to do at Fort Campbell. But in the process of working with the Atlanta campaign in the thesis and the dissertation, I got interested in John Bell Hood. And the first book I wrote was actually a biography of John Bell Hood. And then much of what I've done since then has grown out of thinking about Hood, his role in the war, the controversies he got in, the importance of the battles that he fought, and it has led from one book to another. You write about Hood, and he fought in both Virginia and the West, so that leads you into thinking about why the difference between the Confederacy's fate in Virginia and the Confederacy's fate in Tennessee and Georgia. And that led into a book that I had a lot of fun with called Two Great Rebel Armies, comparing the Confederate Army in Georgia, Tennessee, with the Confederate Army in Virginia. And I concluded that the main difference between them, in a word, was Lee. And then that led, actually it didn't lead, I was dragged into writing a book about the Atlanta campaign for a University of Nebraska series. Ann Bailey, who is a fine historian, was at Georgia College in Milledgeville and was the co-editor of that series. And she called me up. She said, I want you to write. And I don't want to write a book on it. I have a hard time saying no to the ladies. Unfortunately, the reverse of that is not true. And so Ann kind of dragooned me into writing this book. And after that, I decided, well, I made this statement in Two Great Rebel Armies that one of the strengths of the Army of Northern Virginia was it had all these people in positions who had some previous military training, like the VMI alumni, the alumni, I probably shouldn't say this, the alumni from the Citadel, the Citadel. And I need to prove that, so I did a book about VMI alumni in the Civil War. And sure enough, most of them fought in the Army of Northern Virginia. And I maintained it wasn't that they fought that well, but they were lieutenants and captains and sergeants, and the primary job of a lieutenant, a captain, a sergeant is to teach. And I had this funny idea that if you want to teach, it really helps if you know something about what you're teaching. I realize this is contradictory to everything that's done in education today. But if you want to teach mathematics, it helps if you know mathematics. If you want to teach drill, manual of arms, how to use a weapon, it helps if you know how to do so. And people who spent 2, 3, 4 years in a military school were more likely to know how to do that than somebody who had been a lawyer or a farmer or some other occupation. And that was particularly true when it came to things like handling artillery. You say, well, a farmer knows how to shoot, or at least did in the 1800s, but he doesn't know how to shoot as a member of a infantry company. And he certainly doesn't know how to use a piece of artillery. And by having this cadre of VMI people, Citadel people, North Carolina Military Institute people in the Army of Northern Virginia, much more so than in the Army of Tennessee, you had a cadre of young officers who could do that. So that led to the book on the VMI alumni. And all this ultimately led to the project I'm working on now, which is a biography of Joseph E. Johnston. When I was growing up in Atlanta, Joseph E. Johnston was just the greatest thing since grits. And the whole process of studying the Atlanta campaign and other parts of the war has been a disillusionment as far as Joe Johnston is concerned. The man had a reputation that I don't think he deserved, that in some ways he was not a person that you would like to be around. He, for example, joined with General Longstreet in falsely blaming another general for a mishandled battle in Virginia, and did that during the war. And I think his Atlanta campaign was a disaster for the Confederacy, not because he lost battles, but because he was giving up territory that the Confederacy could not afford to lose. And Jefferson Davis knew this at the time. And he said, you're exposing all this territory, particularly in Alabama, Mississippi, in Georgia. And the Confederacy could not have survived the loss of that. And I think it was lost when Johnston was in command.
Gotcha. So you think that the crossing of the figurative Rubicon when it comes to Confederacy is when they go from Bragg to Johnston. When that decision is made, that's the death knell of that campaign, you think?
I'd have to think about that. I frankly don't know whom Davis would have appointed if he didn't appoint Johnston. He didn't get along with Johnston. I mean, they hated each other. And the only real alternative to Johnston was General Beauregard. And as Johnston himself said, if there's anybody Davis hates more than he hates me, it's Beauregard. There's an interesting take on that by the historian Stephen Woodworth. And it goes back to Leonidas Polk, the lieutenant general in the Confederacy. Polk was usually the second highest ranking Confederate general between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. He was second in command because he outranked, Bragg outranked him, but he was second in command. Johnston outranked him, but he was second in command. Albert Sidney Johnston outranked him, but he was second in command. And Steve Woodworth says because of that, he was a bottleneck. And a lot of much better younger generals, people like Patrick Cleburne and Alexander P. Stewart, could not be promoted because there's Polk. And it wasn't until he was killed. And Polk was a pompous, disputatious man who had great difficulty taking orders. He didn't get along with Braxton Bragg personally. He, in effect, led a cabal against Bragg that really undermined the Confederacy. If there's any one man that, that's probably too strong, but he did a lot to destroy the effectiveness of people like Bragg, and it was just a major obstacle. How did I get off on that? What were we talking about?
Okay, this is good. This is because I was going to go into it, so it's perfect. Speaking on what you said about Polk, and then you mentioned Hood earlier. Reading on on the topic of the Atlanta campaign is just, it's illuminating to see just how you mentioned that Davis wasn't a big fan of Johnston and he didn't like Beauregard, but he did like Hood, right? That was Hood was trying to curry favor a lot during that, right?
Well, I think he liked Hood. They had almost no personal contact.
Okay.
They probably met once before the war when Hood was in Washington. That's not certain, but it's probable. They probably met once. I know they met once, maybe more, in 1862, briefly, during the Battle of Seven Pines or just before it. They may have met during the summer of 1862, but it would have been some brief social, reception or something. They really got acquainted in the winter of 1863, 1864. Hood had lost a leg at Chickamauga, and he was in Richmond recuperating. And they did meet then. He was the great hero. And all Richmond was just sort of gaga with Hood up there. Davis and Hood met. They apparently got along well together. It is often said that Davis rewarded Hood for being his accomplice against Johnston. That's simply not true. Braxton Bragg and James Longstreet both recommended Hood for promotion long before he got to Richmond, almost immediately after the Battle of Chickamauga. Bragg specifically asked that he be assigned to the Army of Tennessee, and Davis committed himself to do it before Hood got to Richmond. So it's obvious, that Davis didn't send him out there as his spy. Hood was the most distinguished major general in the Confederacy in the fall of 1863. And there was only one place for a newly promoted lieutenant general to go, and that was the Army of Tennessee. Hood seems to have become disillusioned with Joe Johnston as Johnston retreated and missed opportunities to fight Sherman. And probably by the time the Army crossed the Etowah River, Hood was convinced that it's one of these things where he is honestly convinced that this is bad, and he is ambitious. So you got both of those. So,
what's the age difference between the two men?
Johnston and Hood. Johnston was born in 1807, Hood in 1831. 24 years, if I remember my math.
That's a good bit of, okay, so there's a generation or two.
Yeah, Johnston graduated from West Point in 1829, Hood in 1853.
And do you mentioned, the disillusionment with Johnston came from the constant retreating, giving up the land, and do you think that ultimately plays into Hood's strategy? Because he leads Franklin, right? I know we talked about Franklin earlier. So Franklin, when they're, when he's just sending guys, just go like charge. Do you think a part of that is just from him thinking about Johnston retreating constantly? This is just a knee-jerk, maybe not a knee-jerk reaction, but it's something it's been so to his mind that this doesn't work, so I have to do the opposite to just send my men out there. We have to get this land to make a stand.
I think when Hood took command of the Army in Atlanta, his model was Robert E. Lee. In fact, I argue in the biography of him that the influence of Lee was one of the great experiences that shaped Hood. I also argue that another great experience was his service in the battles in 1862. And in those battles and at Chickamauga, Hood had gained success by the headlong charge at Gaines Mill, at Second Manassas. At Chickamauga, Hood had just charged. And he tried, when he took command in Atlanta, these flank movements. He did not go out in July and August 1864 to attack fortifications. He planned brilliantly to take advantage of mistakes Sherman had made. And all three times, Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, and Ezra Church, it didn't work because his subordinate generals messed up the plans. They didn't go where they were supposed to go. They attacked piecemeal. They attacked too soon. I argue that the generals in the Army of Tennessee were not good. There were some good ones, but on the whole, they did not measure up to the generals in the Army of Northern Virginia. And they didn't function as the generals in the Army of Northern Virginia did. And the Army of Tennessee could not execute these plans of maneuver that Hood worked out. He tried it around Atlanta. It didn't work. He took the army north to Tennessee and at Spring Hill. It didn't work. He pulled a brilliant maneuver at Spring Hill. He marched around, got behind the Union Army, and then the whole thing just fell apart. Part of it was probably Hood's fault. He did not see that they did what he ordered them to do. But part of it was their fault. And I think that when they got to Franklin, he was just flat out frustrated. I have tried to get these jokers to maneuver here, do that. They can't do that. I did get success in 1862 with the headlong charge. Let's try it here. It probably wasn't that clear, but I think that's the pattern. And by the way, he was not on laudanum at Franklin. That much is clear.
Explain that for me.
Oh, okay. A lot of people argue.
Oh, the drug.
The drug.
Sorry, yes.
Hood was not on laudanum or any other drug. We know that now because we have a day-by-day account of the surgeon or the doctor who treated him after his leg was amputated. The only drug he mentions is a quarter grain of morphine for about 5 weeks after the leg was amputated, always at night, always to help him get to sleep. And then there's the entry, tonight he slept without morphine for the first time, and there's no more mention of morphine, and no mention at all of laudanum.
Gotcha. Okay. Let's rewind time a bit. I know we're at Franklin right now, but let's rewind a bit. So talk to me, I've read your book, Atlanta 1864, and I got to see you speak, years ago at the Cobb Civil War Roundtable. Talk to me about, in particular, looking at the Confederacy, talking about, we're here at New Hope Church, where the Battle of New Hope Church, Dallas is right down the road, Pickett's Mill is right down the road. At that point in, the Atlanta campaign, what are we looking at when it comes to Confederate generals? You mentioned that, some of them were just very, very not good, and some of them were, pretty good. Like I know you mentioned some affinity for Claiborne, and then we talked about Polk. Kind of just walk me through, what's Johnston have in his rosters of generals at this point in the Atlanta campaign?
What does he have? He had a bunch of generals that he distrusted. He made several comments earlier when he was organizing the army to the effect that I need good generals. He wrote Jefferson Davis, well, if he needed good generals, why didn't he say, let's get rid of so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so who's a bad general and replace him with somebody else? He wouldn't do that. He was very passive.
Was that out of respect, or was it just because of his passivity?
I think it was the fact that his attitude was, I tell Davis I need good generals. If he wants to know more, he should ask me, which is passive. Unlike Lee. Lee would say, General so-and-so, well, a brave and courageous officer, can't lead troops. He would make a fine permanent president of a military board of inquiry in the Department of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Ship him out there. And next thing you know, the guy's out there, and Lee has replaced him with somebody else. Johnston didn't do that. It's pretty good that he thought some of his generals were incompetent, but they'd been assigned by Davis. And his attitude seems to have been, if Davis wants to know what I think about them, Davis can ask. And that's not the way to do it. We mentioned George Marshall earlier. In World War II, in 1941, the famous Louisiana maneuvers, where Marshall took most of the U.S. Army down to western Louisiana, East Texas, for about a month or so of war games. And out of the, I think it was, if I remember right, 52 generals, there was exactly one who performed satisfactorily, Walter Kruger. And the rest of them, they were out of the Army. They were assigned to command latrine details at Fort Diddley Squat, Utah. Eisenhower said he went in there and he just threw them out. And he was right, because they get men killed. And Johnston didn't have that kind of, what I guess you would call proactivity to do that. Partly maybe because he didn't get along with Davis. Partly because these people were officers and couldn't be treated that way. That was one of his really great weaknesses, was he was passive. And if you've ever read a book by a man named Stephen Covey called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, the habit number 1 is proactivity. Don't sit and wait and let things happen. Johnston would sit and wait. Tried to fight the Atlanta campaign that way. He would sit and wait for Sherman to attack him. And Sherman, we know now, had already decided that attacks on fortified positions usually don't work. And if they do work, it's at such cost that they don't really accomplish anything.
And talk to me, so when he's appointed, the leader of this army, so at this point, is he coming out of that injury that he had at the beginning of the war? Or what was his accolades? What shined through for Davis to be like, okay, it's him. I'm going to have to, you mentioned that he was a big fan of him. Like, what makes Davis decide this is going to be Johnston's command?
Basically, there was nobody else. There was a lot of pressure to appoint Johnston. But there's no other full general. Cooper, the highest ranking general, is an administrative officer. Albert Sidney Johnston is dead. Lee is essential in Virginia. If you send him, who's going to replace him? Johnston is there. Beauregard, Davis hates Beauregard. Braxton Bragg has just been removed. There's no other general. How about the lieutenant generals? Longstreet is the ranking lieutenant general. He's just been defeated at Knoxville by Burnside, of all people. Kirby Smith is the second ranking lieutenant general. He's messed up the Kentucky campaign, didn't get along with Bragg, who would be Davis's advisor, and he was in the Trans-Mississippi. Polk is the next ranking lieutenant general. He's demonstrated his unfitness. Stonewall Jackson is dead. Pemberton surrendered Vicksburg. Holmes is old and decrepit. Ewell is in bad health. A.P. Hill is in bad health. Who are you going to appoint? Johnston's the only one.
Gotcha. So Davis at this point he's in dire straits.
Well, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier about Stephen Woodworth and Polk being the bottleneck. Davis needed to wake up to the fact and say, something is wrong out in the West. What is it? It's Polk. Leonidas, old buddy, I want to make you chaplain general of the Confederacy. You'll be in charge of the chaplains. Or I want to send, better yet, I want to send you to England to meet with the Anglican clergy. Polk was an Episcopal bishop. Send you to England to meet with the Anglican clergy and convince them that the Confederacy is right. And ship him off to England. With luck, he'll be captured by the federal blockaders, and we won't get him back. And then he could promote Stewart and Claiborne and all these other guys.
Right. Gotcha. And let's go a little bit more into Polk. I've heard you speak on him that one time at Cobb, the Civil War Roundtable, where I realized I was pronouncing his name wrong the entire time. But just talk to me really, get into why was he so eccentric? What's Polk's deal? And like how did he rise so far? Is it politics? Is his family like very well off? Did they have like a hand in the Richmond politics at the time? Talk to me.
Well, as I mentioned, he was an Episcopal bishop. And the Episcopal Church was very high in Southern society. The old saying, there are many roads to heaven, but only one is fit for a gentleman. And that's the Episcopal Church. Bill Wiley used to say that had been a bishop too long to take orders from anybody else. Not like the Catholic Church where you got the Pope who would be in that position. In the Episcopal Church, Polk, as the Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana, was pretty much on his own. He associated in high levels. He was the founding father of the University of the South. He was high in ecclesiastical, educational, social. Episcopal bishop's going to be high up there in social matters. Part of it probably stemmed from the fact that early on in the war, he could not get along with Braxton Bragg. Bragg was chief of staff of the Army when Albert Sidney Johnston assembled it, and was very critical of Polk because of the poor discipline in Polk's command, called Polk's mob. And they just couldn't get along right off the bat. Polk was probably sincerely convinced that Bragg was incompetent and had to go, and he couldn't get Davis to dismiss him. He recommended that on several occasions. And Bragg recommended that Polk be gotten rid of, and Davis would not do it.
For the Atlanta campaign, how did Polk do?
He was not in the Atlanta campaign long enough to do much. He'd been with the Army until the previous summer or fall, and Davis finally transferred him to Mississippi. And then in mid-May 1864, he came back to Georgia, brought about 20,000 troops to reinforce Johnston's army. And he was killed within a month and really didn't have time to do much.
I know this it's in Kennesaw, but talk to me about his death. I mean, the shocking nature of it. I mean, like, I don't know if all these gentlemen are passed away, so I don't know if I can say this, but was there a sense of relief once he was gone, that the bottleneck was finally gone?
Not so much in the Army itself. I'm sure there was one in Braxton Bragg's office in Richmond. We finally rid of that old so-and-so. Johnston immediately recommended A.P. Stewart as his replacement, and it took Davis from June 14th to July 7th for Stewart to get in command. But Polk was popular with a lot of the troops, but they were sad he was gone. But I think it was General French, one of the Confederate officers. He was a good man, but not much of a general. And
gotcha. And so I don't really know how to approach, but just when, prior to, Kennesaw Mountain, we have our battles here in Paulding County. Is there anything you can tell me about just, their kind of, the perspective of those battles? Because, I mean, I talked to Brad Butkovich not too long ago, like we were talking about earlier, and, a lot of these battles here, these three battles that we have here in Paulding, are forgotten about. And Sherman never mentions, the defeats that he, really took here with Pickett's Mill. And I think, was New Hope a Confederate victory as well? Was that considered?
New Hope, yeah.
But Dallas was what undermined everything because it was just such a disaster. And then, Sherman made sure to mention, Dallas was a great victory, and everything else is just kind of like, what? That never happened, So talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, the key thing about the fighting both here and at Kennesaw Mountain was rain. It rained almost every day. Heavy rains that mired the armies down. And Johnston, I think, was quite happy to have that. Simply they could sit here. That was his favorite kind of war. Just sit here and wait. Sherman had taken his army away from the railroad. And because of that, he had to get back. But it was a slow process because of the rain, the roads. It was like he was sort of moving to the west to get around Allatoona Pass. And then, if this is Allatoona Pass, he's moving to the west to get around it, and then he comes back south of it. So he's achieved what he wants to achieve. And it took so long because of the rain.
Gotcha. And just once the fighting finally started, I mean, what are we looking at here? I mean, is this some of the, is this? I know they used a lot of trench warfare here in Pickett's Mill. I mean, is it kind of like a predecessor to World War I, you'd say, in that style of fighting? I guess in that sense.
It's often been compared to that. They were here for so long. Most of the Atlanta campaign, you're at a place for 2 or 3 days at most, and then you're moving somewhere else. And they don't have time to do anything other than very hasty fortification. Pile up some trees, pile up some rocks, maybe scratch out a little shallow ditch. But they were here for so long that they could build very elaborate works. Much the same thing was going on in Virginia. And they were discovering that if somebody's shooting at you, it's better to be in a trench than standing up in the open. And so they went at it right away, using logs, dirt, anything they could get to provide a shelter. And it did become very elaborate, not as elaborate as some of the things on more permanent fortifications like Vicksburg or Port Hudson or Petersburg, but much more so than they had done before.
Gotcha. And kind of a different year. I want you to, and if you're cool with this, just can we go through just, Johnston's leading the Confederates. So we'll just start with the Confederate side first, and maybe swap over to the Union if you don't mind. Kind of walk me through Johnston and his lieutenants and kind of go down the line and just talk to me about just a little bit about each one of them and just, if he's a good general or lieutenant or bad, just kind of what you thought of all these guys that are in his side, and then we can swap over maybe to Sherman and his guys.
Well, Johnston's army, was, as it ultimately became, was organized into 3 infantry corps and a cavalry corps. The infantry corps, the senior commander when he was here was Polk. And we've already talked about Polk. Davis made him a general to start with in June 1861, which made him senior to all the others, all the other lieutenant generals. Did that primarily to use his prestige in the Mississippi Valley. As I say, we already talked about him. The second ranking lieutenant general was William J. Hardee, a veteran U.S. Army, authority on infantry tactics, native Georgian from down in southeastern Georgia. He and Polk had both been with the Army of Tennessee since the earliest days. Hardee, he wasn't brilliant, but he was more like sturdy, reasonably dependable. He came under the influence of Polk and was an anti-Bragg man. The Third Corps was commanded by John Bell Hood. We talked about him. The Cavalry Corps was commanded by Joseph Wheeler, who was not a really serious is the wrong word. Wheeler was not a very good Corps commander. He was fine in small battles, but he was extremely young. Born, I believe, in 1836, but I'd have to check. And kind of irresponsible, loved to take part in actions himself, which is not what a Corps commander is supposed to do. He's supposed to sit back and see what's happening so he can direct the whole thing. Wheeler was fairly good in small unit action, terrible when it came to larger operations. A couple of times during the war, he led a major cavalry raid that just disintegrated and wound up with his command in shambles. Poor administrator, often neglected scouting, taking care of his troops, not really that good. That takes care of it when Johnston was in command. And then, as I mentioned, A.P. Stewart became commander of what had been Polk's Corps about a week before Johnston left the Army. Stewart was probably the best of the Corps commanders in the Atlanta campaign. The Third Corps, after Hood was promoted, Stephen D. Lee became Corps commander. He was not all that good. You just run out of these people because you know, really so many of the good ones get killed at lower ranks. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
It does. So, sticking with what you originally said, with Wheeler, with Hardee, Hood, and Polk in the infantry, and Wheeler at the cavalry, and Johnston at the mass with the command, would you say Hardee's the most reliable and sturdy at this point in the war?
In the Army of Tennessee, yes. In the war, if you mean to include others, all of the others, no.
Gotcha. But he's the best. It's one of those things, it seems like what you're getting at is like, really he's the best of the worst.
Yeah, I was going to say the best of a bad bunch, but it's same thing, yeah.
Gotcha. And before we swap over to the Union side, just real quick, you've mentioned Claiborne. Was he one of those guys that just, throughout the war, I've heard so many people mention that he just is very underrated, very up until I guess recently, if you've been around longer than I have with the history. Claiborne seems like he's just like an unsung hero up until Franklin, right? Because that's where he passes away.
Well, he had a distinguished record for the war. He enlisted as a private, and he had been in the British Army. He was an Irishman by birth, and had been in the British Army. Enlisted as a private, as a man who knew to drill, manual of arms. He was very quickly promoted, became a captain, regimental commander, brigade commander. Extremely good at training his troops, had probably the best troops in the Army of Tennessee, Cleburne's division, as it became, wounded at the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky, shot basically through the mouth, and lost some teeth. Widely regarded as a candidate for promotion, but in December 1863, as you probably know, he proposed using blacks as soldiers in the Confederate Army and granting them freedom for themselves and their families. And this horrified a lot of Confederates, and that's supposed to be one reason why he never went any higher. But he's probably everybody's favorite subordinate general in the Army of Tennessee.
And that's probably the main factor why he never raised as high as he probably could have.
Well, there was a lot of prejudice against the Irish. In some cases, against immigrants. It was a factor. I don't know. Probably he was not a West Point graduate. And at that time, all the lieutenant generals were West Point graduates.
So in many ways, Claiborne is just an oddball in this Army, but he's done so much good. But it's one of those things where I mean, what did his men think about him? Did his men love him?
His men worshipped him. Among other things, in the Great Snowball Battle, in the winter quarters, he fought in the ranks, throwing snowballs. And after the battle, he authorized a ration of whiskey, which made him very popular with the troops, just antifreeze. After that, he was very popular with the troops.
Gotcha, but it was probably, though he was on the boots on the ground, his men loved him. It was probably, you would say, a factor of politics in Richmond that kind of kept him to a certain level.
Well, he didn't fit the mold of what they wanted. And as I said, Jefferson Davis was a great believer in West Point, in the training that you got. All right to have these lawyers and people like that commanding a regiment or a brigade, even in some cases a division. But it was rare to get them higher than that. And it wasn't until they started to run out of West Point people. First, I believe I'm right on this, every division commander in Lee's army up through the Battle of Chancellorsville was a West Point graduate. And the next one was a VMI graduate. That was Robert Rhodes, who was in some ways like Claiborne.
Gotcha. And going back to schooling, so you've got, how would you rank the schools that a lot of these generals came from? Would it be West Point was looked at as like kind of the prestige, and then VMI, then you mentioned the Citadel. Where would you put them? I know you probably have
VMI's up here, and the others are down here some.
Yeah.
I've tried without success to get 2 sons to go to VMI, and I failed. And I'm working on 5 grandchildren, and I've already failed with 3 of them. So, but I still got hopes. We'll see what happens. VMI did not train people for the military. It trained people for civilian life using military methods. And VMI graduates, very few were professional military. They tended to become engineers. It was basically an engineering school. To become teachers. Number became lawyers. But if for no other reason than that VMI was older than the Citadel in the North Carolina Military Institute, the Georgia Military Institute, I would have to rate it higher, even though I went there. They were all modeled on West Point. So I'm not the person to ask that question.
Gotcha. But looking through the lens of like Davis and Lincoln and those guys that are appointing, these people, you'd say, what would you say? Like it was West Point. You said then Citadel, then VMI, or where would they put them?
They'd probably put VMI after West Point, if for no other reason than the fact that it had existed so long relative to the others, and it produced so many more alumni.
Gotcha. Okay.
I might add that the majority of, maybe I mentioned this earlier, the Citadel alumni, the graduates of almost all of these schools wound up in the Army of Northern Virginia. And that was true of things like the Florida Seminary of Learning, which you may have heard of as Florida State University, or the Louisiana the Louisiana Seminary of Learning and Military Academy at Pineville, now Louisiana State University. First president, William T. Sherman. Because when the war started, the graduates of those schools volunteered right off the bat. And the units that were organized early in the war are the units that went to Virginia.
Now we've talked about Sherman some. Talk to me about this Atlanta campaign as they're gearing up. We have Sherman at the head, who is familiar with the South. If I remember right, I knew he had been through Marietta as a surveyor, maybe.
He was tracking down veterans of the Seminole Wars, I believe for maybe pensions that they were entitled to, land grants, Mexican War probably, and he traveled through the area.
Gotcha. And talk to me the Southern perspective of Sherman is that he, has, devil horns and, vampire teeth and a pointy tail. Talk to me about who Sherman really is and just just his strategy coming into this.
This is going to surprise you. I like Sherman.
Okay.
I think with the possible exception of Lincoln, he's the most interesting person coughed up by the war. He's a fascinating man. You can't trust him. His memoirs, somebody said the only thing less trustworthy than Sherman's official correspondence is his memoir. And the same thing is true of Joe Johnston. Much too much writing about both of them has been based only on their memoirs. Don't trust them. But I like Sherman. His reputation in Georgia has been greatly exaggerated. Alan Julian, who was a retired Army officer, lived in Atlanta in the 1930s and 40s, 50s, got interested in Atlanta history. And he and Wilbur Kurtz wrote a lot of these historical markers. And Julian told the story that he was visiting an elderly woman in Marietta one time to talk to her. Oh, it was horrible. General Sherman burned everything, stole everything. It was horrible. Now let's go out and I'll show you our beautiful antebellum homes. Where'd those antebellum homes come from if Sherman burned everything, including the house that my mother was born in? That dates to the 1840s. And somehow Sherman didn't burn it. It's much exaggerated, mostly because Sherman exaggerated in the telling. A little different in South Carolina, but in Georgia, it's not. And I think Sherman is fascinating. I'd like to have met him. I'd tell you some of the quotations from him, but you don't want that.
I mean, I kind of might. I mean, if you want to, you just,
No, that's all right.
okay, that's fine.
It's like quoting Harry Truman.
Oh, yeah, I see. Yeah.
A friend of mine who knew Truman said, you wanted to know what he thought, ask him and get out of the way, especially on Douglas MacArthur.
Kind of talk to me of just a little bit of his career before this, coming into the Atlanta campaign, and just overall as they're gearing up and what their strategy is. You talked a little bit about, getting past Altoona Pass and getting, that kind of thing. Just kind of get me into the kind of general scale of this.
Well, John Marzalek, who taught at Mississippi State, wrote a biography of Sherman, and his basic thesis is that Sherman, in Sherman's entire life, before he got hooked up with Grant, was essentially chaos. Sherman's father died when he was very young. He was raised by a foster family. He married his foster sister. His foster father tried to get him to work for him. He did go to West Point, was frustrated in the Mexican War, spent it in California, didn't get into combat, left the Army, failed in banking, not his fault, bank panic, and several other occupations. Was essentially bumming around in St. Louis, where he met another bum who failed, named Ulysses S. Grant. And when the war started, Grant and Sherman, because they were West Point graduates, were snatched up and assigned to command. Sherman had a little advantage there because his brother was a powerful senator. His father-in-law was a powerful political figure, been in the cabinet. Sherman wound up being sent out to command in Kentucky. He was loath to accept the responsibility, was very unsure about it, made the mistake of saying that it's going to take 200,000 men to win the war out here, which led to Sherman's insane. And he was, in fact, relieved from command, sent home to rest, brought back to the Army eventually, wound up being assigned to Ulysses S. Grant's command, and performed well as sending reinforcements to Grant, supplies at Fort Donelson, and was put in command of a division, was at Shiloh. And again, when the Confederates attacked, Sherman and his division fought very well, and he and Grant got to be very close, and they sort of leaned on each other. Sherman said, Grant stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk, and we could get along together. And as Grant moved up, Sherman moved up as Grant's protege. And by 1864, when Grant was made the supreme commander, Sherman took his place over a senior general, and I think a better general, George Thomas. But Grant and Thomas did not get along. And Sherman and Grant did. And because of that, Grant picked Sherman. He was not a good battlefield commander in the sense of destroying the enemy. He would not have become that kind of commander. You know, we got to kill every man the enemy has, wipe him out. He instead, as I said earlier, became convinced frontal assaults don't accomplish anything. Better to destroy the enemy's resources. Cut the railroads. I'm convinced Sherman's Atlanta campaign was a flank attack on Lee. That Lee's left flank was at Chattanooga. not in Virginia. And Sherman marched around it to Savannah, and then he was in the rear of Lee's army. And as I said earlier, his men did more damage in South Carolina than in Georgia. Punish South Carolina. But they were, after the war, excuse me, after the war, Sherman followed Grant as the commanding general and spent a lot of his time going around with his old veterans. They loved him. He was Uncle Billy. They even on occasion called him that to his face. And yeah, as I say, I'm just fascinated by the man. Read his correspondence. He was one of these people who slept 2 or 3 hours a night, talked incessantly, wrote incessantly. I sometimes think he must have been writing different letters with both hands at the same time while he was talking to somebody. And there's a book of his letters that's about that thick, and it's only some of them. Selected letters, selected wartime letters of William T. Sherman, let alone what he wrote otherwise. I'd love to talk with him, as I said.
How close was he to becoming, like, I know he turned it down, and I don't know how much it's exaggerated in the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, but is it ironic that, like, you know, his brother was a politician and ran for president, and, you know, that was unsuccessful and that kind of thing with, you know, the Garfield election and all that stuff. But Sherman, he could have had it if he wanted it.
The presidency?
Yes or no?
His famous quotation, well, actually he has two. If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. And his other one, I'm not qualified to be president. I have not been in the penitentiary. He could have had it. I don't think he didn't want it. He had the sense to stay out of it.
And do you think, I mean, I've heard this saying where it's like, when it comes to being a king, comes to being a president, usually the best guy for that job is the one that doesn't want it. I mean, what do you think about that?
I think it's true. I think the best president we had in the second half of the 20th century was Dwight Eisenhower. He didn't want it. He ran to keep Robert Taft from getting the Republican nomination. But I think that's true. You pretty much have to be crazy to want to be president. Massive ego. I don't know why anybody wants the job. I mean, you have a nice place to live, but as Barack Obama said, we have a nice clubhouse.
Talked about crazy, so, you know, many people thought that he was crazy, and then, like, was it Sherman that he had, like, panic attacks?
In late 1861, early 62, when he was convinced. Albert Sidney Johnston was the Confederate commander out in that area, and he was doing a masterful job of feinting at the Federals, convincing them that he had a massive force, which he did not have. And they were just, Albert Sidney Johnston sneaking up on us. He's around somewhere with 80,000 men, and he's going to attack us. And Sherman had a nervous breakdown about that responsibility.
And this is about Sherman, but it's also just about the generals in totality. It's something I thought of when you were talking about, you know, just with Johnston and his relationship with Davis. It seems like there was a lot. I mean, this is kind of like an understatement, but it seems like there was a lot of stress. And I don't know if it's just impounded by, you have the politics back home that are going on. You're trying to fight, you know, not only, you know, an actual war where men are going to die, and for, you know, for both sides, I think for a greater purpose, but just you have so many things going on, and then even after the war, you're fighting for your legacy to be remembered in the annals of history as one of the good ones. Talk to me about that.
Well, on top of all that, you've also got whatever affected you personally. Somebody who came out of a background like Lee did, an aristocratic background, it tends to be, it seems to be more self-confident. I know Tom Connolly argues Lee was frightened, he was insecure, he was unhappy. I think that's nonsense. I think Lee was very secure. Somebody like Joseph E. Johnston was not. Lee was from an old aristocratic Tidewater, Virginia family. They'd been prominent. He was related to, I believe it was 5 of the 7 men from Virginia who signed the Declaration of Independence. You know, it's pretty good connections. His father had been governor, a major general. He had finished in the highest cadet position at West Point, second in his class to the legendary Charles Mason, who had already graduated from Harvard and came to West Point. Lee was Winfield Scott's protege. I think the man was very confident, and it gave him the self-possession not to worry about all these things. On the other hand, somebody who came out of a different background, and I think I put Joe Johnston in this, new money, new frontier section of Virginia, father a lowly lieutenant in the War for Independence. To him, symbols were very important. Lee didn't worry about it. I go back to the story in World War II, where John Eisenhower graduated from West Point in 1944. His father did not attend the graduation. He was busy in June 1944. So John Eisenhower took leave and went to Europe to visit his father. And we got there, they were going out for a cup of coffee. Newly spanking new second lieutenant John Eisenhower, 4-star General Dwight Eisenhower. John said, "What happens if we should happen to meet an officer who ranks above me but below you? Who salutes first?" And Eisenhower, yeah, I can just see how, with that grin on his face, he said, "John, there's not an Allied officer in Europe who does not rank above you and below me. Don't worry about it." You know, a 4-star general would not worry about it. A brand new second lieutenant would. It's like people who get their PhDs, particularly from rinky-dink schools. They insist on being called doctor. People who are more self-confident don't. I can remember calling people on the telephone, "Dr. so-and-so," or when I called my mentor, "Wiley here," to go back to Mel Wiley. You know, they don't fool with that nonsense. It's the insecure people who do. And I think that's one of Johnston's problems, not one of Lee's. But you have to add that in to all the other factors that affect the person. And I'm not sure, it might be the most important. If you have real self-confidence, you believe in yourself, you know you're capable, you know you're competent, that you can do this. Sherman had doubts at the beginning of the war. And it wasn't until he got to working with Grant that he developed the self-confidence. Joseph E. Johnston, I don't think ever had that self-confidence. He was obsessed with titles and rank. And when Jefferson Davis denied him the rank that he thought he deserved or had, that he broke with Davis and never got the self-confidence.
Is the American just mindset of the underdog, the person who comes from nothing, who's failed in everything, and finds success, is that embodied in Grant and Sherman? Because with all the, going against Lee, who's just, like you mentioned, aristocratic background, who has ties to Washington and the founding fathers, is that an embodiment of what we envision just kind of being American today, that these two guys who failed at so much, that was the ghost of Sherman coming in. He's like, yeah, I want to hear this.
Yeah. Have a seat, General.
People in the South never talk about me.
Hey, you never know. But just, going back to the question, just kind of it's on paper, I mean, you have Grant who, is trying to solve the problem of poverty, after the Mexican, War, and Sherman who's having a panic attack in the very early Civil War. These guys are able to, on different fronts, with the support of many others, not just them, obviously, able to beat, Lee, who's this general that, has all these accolades, who has that just almost a holiness about him to many people, and has, ties to when America was made a country.
Grant and Sherman both illustrate that. And they were both in a situation where something put them in circumstances where they could perform well. In some cases, they were lucky. They were always intelligent. The ingredients for what made them what they ultimately became were always there. They just had to be in circumstances where those ingredients could come to the forefront. And I think with Grant, it took the form of getting assigned to, I believe it was the 21st Illinois Regiment at the beginning of the war, because he was a West Point graduate. And then getting assigned to Cairo, Illinois, and command there, and the circumstances that enabled him to act as he did early on at Fort Donelston, Fort Henry, and Fort Donelston. And with Sherman, it was the fact that his friend, who was in command in that area, Henry Halleck, arranged, when Sherman was insane, arranged for Sherman to get a leave of absence, send him home, send him back to his family, to his wife, his foster family, let him rest. And then when he came back, don't put him in a stressful situation. Put him in charge of blankets. You're supposed to have so many blankets here, count them and issue them to the troops. Good work. Now let's try something else. Try shoes. Count those. And building up into this position where he could work essentially for Grant, who was down besieging Fort Donelston. And that gave him the opportunity. The ingredients were there, but they got in a situation where the ingredients could become effective, become significant. And I think that's the key.
Would you say Fort Donelson's, is that Grant's breaking out moment where after that capture and taking that over, I think that's where he gets the unconditional surrender Grant title? Talk to me about that. Is that that's the moment that he takes a turn in this war?
That's the moment that I think made Grant. It's argued that that's the important part of the war. There's even a book about it, I forget who wrote it, called something to the effect that that's where the war was won, was the loss of Fort Donelston and Fort Henry. Very close to each other, Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, Donelston on the Cumberland River, but the rivers were only about 10 or 12 miles apart. And when Grant captured the Navy captured Fort Henry. Grant was on the way, but the Navy got it before he got there, mostly because it was basically underwater, thanks to a flood in the river. And when Grant got there, the Navy had it, but he turned right away and went to Fort Donelston. And that opened up the whole Mississippi area. And it forced the Confederates to give up what they had of Kentucky, West and Middle Tennessee, and really carried the war as far south as the Tennessee River, which is in northern Alabama. And that was the moment that I think made Grant. He went from there to Shiloh. And again, he was lucky. Confederates caught him by surprise at Shiloh, but they didn't have the strength to finish him off. And you capture Fort Donelson, you win at Shiloh, you take command, and you go after Vicksburg. And eventually he got it. And that string of victories, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Vicksburg, that pretty much decided the war, and it certainly decided Grant's career.
Something I haven't mentioned yet, but now that we're on a battle that happened on Independence Day, I want to talk about it. So you have Gettysburg going on with Lee and Meade further away, and you have Vicksburg with the siege of that happening around the anniversary of our country. And I'm sure plenty of people have heard where Shelby Foote mentions they didn't celebrate Vicksburg. I think he's talking about they didn't celebrate independence. They didn't celebrate it for another 50, 100 years, however long it was.
You're talking about the city of Vicksburg.
Correct.
Yeah, they didn't celebrate it again until World War II.
Gotcha. And so, is it true that the Confederates, a lot of them with their cause, they thought that they were the second, American Revolution? Is there any credence to that?
A lot of them thought in those terms, that the first revolution was against England to preserve our rights. The second revolution is what we're doing against the federal government for the same purpose. And they thought in those terms.
Looking at the other side, and I'm sure a lot of these guys on both sides have ancestors who fought in that war. So, on the northern perspective, what do they think? Are they thinking also this is maybe not a revolution in that sense, but understanding that this is our country, we fought, our fathers and our fathers' fathers fought and died for this, and we need to maintain it. Is that kind of their perspective, or what are they thinking?
The mystical thing was the Union. And there was a change that took place between the Declaration of Independence and the Civil War that had a lot to do with Andrew Jackson, that is described brilliantly in a book by a man named John William Ward called Andrew Jackson, Symbol for an Age, which is an interpretation of Jackson's victory at New Orleans, which seemed so miraculous. The British lost 2,000 men, Jackson lost 20. The Americans said, the hand of God. This is America, we're blessed. It's the Union. It became kind of a mystical thing. And what they saw the Confederates doing was attempting to wreck that mystical Union. And our job is to preserve the Union, to hand it on to our descendants. And they saw the Confederates as trying to go against that.
Gotcha. So you have, on the Confederate side, you have the Second American Revolution, and then you have preserve the Union on the other side.
Yeah.
And that's really the main, I don't know if they had a PR department, but that would be on hats and T-shirts back in the day.
Yeah, that's basically what they're doing.
Gotcha. And is there...
I might add also a big religious element in the Union. If God gave us this great victory, then the Union is more than just something that people created. It's kind of a mystical, religious thing. A lot of this comes out in Lincoln. The mystic chords of memory stretching from every patriot's grave. So that's what you're fighting against there.
Gotcha. And just, if we can dive more into that, that'd be great. If not, I understand. But just, I've heard, recently I heard a quote from Lincoln where there's somebody, I don't know who he's talking to, but they're like, I hope God's on our side. And then Lincoln comes back and says, no, we should hope that we're on God's side. Is that a true quote?
I am not familiar with that. The one I'm familiar with is the one where he told a group of abolitionists who were trying to get him to abolish slavery at the beginning of the war. And he knew that Kentucky, a slave state, was anti-secession. And they said, Mr. President, if you act to abolish slavery, you will have God on your side. And Lincoln said, I would like to have God on my side, but I have got to have Kentucky. But I'm not familiar with this other one. But it's a good idea,
Yeah.
like most of Lincoln's ideas.
Right. And religion on both sides, and this is something Jude and I've kind of like heard different perspectives on. You mentioned Polk was Episcopalian, right? So at this point in the war, I mean, is it like, are they mainly like, most people think the South, they think Southern Baptists. But that's not, is that what they're mainly, or is it just a lot of Protestantism? Is there Protestant and Catholic, on different sides? Like, I don't know.
I'm not certain of this, but I believe the predominant denomination in the South at the time of the Civil War was Methodist. There were a lot of Baptists, Presbyterians, mostly with the Scotch-Irish. The Catholic Church was very strong in certain areas in the South. Baltimore, obviously, Maryland was a Catholic colony. New Orleans, with its French heritage, French, Spanish. But the South was Protestant overwhelmingly. But as I say, I think Methodists were the predominant denomination.
Yeah, I believe that totally. I could totally see that because like recently I've a little bit of studying on just the grand scope of the country and like religiosity at that point. The Methodists were so far ahead around this time, I think, in the country with maybe it's the Great Awakening or the Second Great Awakening, I forget. But Methodists were just so far ahead and they had so many numbers at the point. So that totally makes sense. Okay, dialing it back a bit. Going to Sherman again, I know we did this with Johnston earlier where we talked about all his infantry commanders and then the cavalry. Actually, before we do that, sorry. I meant to ask a question about Wheeler. So when it comes to cavalry in this theater of the war, what was that like? Because you mentioned it was mostly wilderness at that time. So, I mean, like, how do you get a horse through, like, a bunch of, like, brush and, I mean, you just do the best you can? Or how, like, was it more muted compared to the other theaters of the war?
It depended on where you were in the South. The primary, you didn't have things like Brandy Station, the great cavalry battle in Virginia. A lot of it was raiding, strike behind enemy lines, destroy supplies, tear up railroads. Wheeler, small scale, Wheeler could do pretty well, but it was when he took 4,000 or 5,000 men off, it just went to pieces. He didn't do a good job at all. The Union cavalry, not until the end of the war, the last months of the war, did the Union cavalry in the West really come into its own. James Harrison Wilson built a Union cavalry force that was probably the biggest and best cavalry force in American horse cavalry in American history. But he didn't get it going until 1865 when they raided into Alabama. Nathan Bedford Forrest, of course, was a raider, a genius with small forces. He probably would have been a disaster if you put him in charge of 15,000 men. because he had such a temper. Couldn't get along with people. But if he had 1,000, there's nobody better.
We talked about Sherman earlier, and I've heard his quote on Forrest. When it comes to Sherman as he gets to the peak of like his military power, is Nathan Bedford Forrest like the guy that he thinks about in his, you said he only slept 2 or 3 hours, in his small, short nightmares? Like, is Forrest the one guy that he's like, if Forrest comes into this, I don't know how it's going to pan out?
That would have probably been true in April, May, June, and July and August 1864, when he was dependent on a railroad that ran back to Chattanooga and Nashville. After that, what Forrest did not much matter. You know, it was brilliant, interesting battles, but its impact on the war after the fall of Atlanta, basically nil. Kind of like what happened in the area west of the Mississippi. Once you determine what happens with Missouri, there's not much west of the Mississippi that's important. Interesting, fascinating, but not important.
You kind of mentioned this already, but cavalry, I've heard it's kind of like a smokescreen to keep you, to scout out and see what the other army's doing and to try to, maybe inflate your numbers, like you said something about that earlier. Is that kind of what it is? I mean, they're just kind of like a luxury to have in an army, or?
No, it was important, but it wasn't important for the kind of things that Wheeler wanted to do, the big cavalry battle. It was important for scouting, finding out what the other guy's doing, for protecting your own flanks, for raiding behind enemy lines, for chasing down enemy raids, but not for the big battle. I mean, you don't have the mass cavalry charge on the infantry in the Civil War that you sometimes had in other wars. The weapons were just too good for it.
I see. And then diving back into the Union side, setting the stage just for the Atlanta campaign, and when we get here, geography on the map, just Sherman, talk to me about Sherman's lieutenants and who's leading his infantry, who's leading his cavalry, and just kind of.
Sherman actually commanded 3 armies. We would call it an army group today. The big one was the Army of the Cumberland, commanded by George H. Thomas, who I think was probably the best battlefield commander on the Union side in the war. Grant and Sherman accused him of being slow. But I think if you had put Thomas in command of this army and Grant in command of this army, each of them facing a Confederate army, Grant would have attacked first, Thomas would have attacked sometime later, but Thomas would have finished first because he made his preparations. And once he got started, he kept going. Grant was attacked now. This comes out most visibly in Nashville in December 1864. The Confederate Army was outside Nashville. The Union government was in a totally needless panic about what the Confederates were going to do. Thomas was in command of the Union force at Nashville, and it was building up. Reinforcements were coming in. Thomas was getting them organized. Grant kept sending in telegrams, attack, attack, attack. And then they had a terrific winter storm, turned the whole area into a sheet of ice. And Grant, attack, attack, attack. And Thomas is there waiting for the ice to melt. And Grant finally got so disgusted that he ordered John A. Logan to go out and relieve Thomas. And then a day or so later, Grant himself started. Meanwhile, the weather broke and Thomas made his attack. And when he finished, he had chased the Confederate Army all the way back south into Alabama. You wait, do it right, and you don't have to do it again. That's beside the point. I think Thomas was a terrific commander. He won the first important Union victory at Mill Springs. He kept a battle from turning into a defeat at Stones River. He kept defeat from turning into disaster at Chickamauga. He saved Grant at Missionary Ridge when Grant's attack failed, and he won the most decisive victory of the war. Hard to beat a record like that.
What was that? You said the most decisive battle. What was that one?
Nashville.
Nashville. Gotcha.
Most decisive on the field. The second part of Sherman's army group was the Army of the Tennessee, commanded by James B. McPherson. That was the army Grant had commanded. And then Sherman had commanded it. And then McPherson. And McPherson was kind of Grant Sherman's protege. He's probably been overrated as a general, but he was killed in the Battle of Atlanta, and he was succeeded by Oliver Howard, who was probably no better than average as an army commander. And the third army that Sherman had was the Army of the Ohio, commanded by John Schofield, which was so small, it was virtually insignificant. Thomas's army was about 65,000 men. McPherson's about 35,000 when he got them all, which he didn't have until June. And Schofield's about 15,000. It was just administrative inertia.
So you said Thomas had 65,000?
65, yeah.
Yeah, so
You asked about cavalry.
Mhm.
Sherman had 4 cavalry divisions. 3 of them in Thomas's army as a cavalry corps, and 1 in the Army of the Ohio. Sherman did not understand cavalry, and he kept the 4 divisions operating separately rather than putting them all together.
was there one person in charge of all the cavalry?
No,
Just Thomas.
other than Sherman.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
There was a cavalry corps in the Army of the Cumberland, commanded by a guy named Elliott, but he was administrative. Sherman took one of the divisions, protect the rear of the army, took another division, go over and guard this flank, took the third one, go over and guard that flank. He separated them, never worked them together.
I see. And talking about numbers, how big is the Union presence here in Georgia at this time, and how big, number-wise, like the Confederate armies at this time?
Sherman's total force was somewhere around 98,000 to 100,000, somewhere in that area. Johnston's force at the beginning of the campaign was about 55,000. But Polk brought about 20,000 from Alabama and Mississippi. There were another 5,000 or 6,000 that were ordered to Johnston from the Atlantic coast. There were Georgia state troops. Johnston's force has been put as high as 84,000. That's probably too high. Somewhere around 70 to 75 would probably be better.
So already starting off numbers-wise, he's at a disadvantage.
Yes, but not that much.
It's not as drastic as there's other cases in the war, I'm assuming. Gotcha. So there's no grace given because, they're not sitting there, well, Johnston lost a battle, but he's down, so many thousand soldiers. That's never a factor of Johnston's,
Johnston thought it was, which is one reason why he was so reluctant to do anything. But he thought he was outnumbered drastically. But that's not bad odds for a Confederate army.
Right, okay. Then McPherson. I could be wrong about this, and maybe you have more insight to it. When McPherson dies, I've heard that's one of the few times Sherman cried.
Could well be. Sherman had a very high opinion of him.
But in your opinion, where do you think McPherson was? He was just, a yes man for directing Sherman, or was he like?
Well, he was more than a yes man, but less than a really outstanding commander.
Mm-hmm. And then you've already mentioned this, but so out of the three, you would say Thomas was.
Oh, far, far, far in a way. I think he's better than Sherman. If Thomas had been in command, they probably would not have started until maybe mid-May. But they would have finished by July 4th.
So do you think Johnston in a way got off easy to a certain degree because Thomas
Yes. There are several occasions where Sherman had a chance to wipe Johnston out. Right at the beginning, if you're familiar with that area where it began up near Dalton, the key was Snake Creek Gap, which was the key to all of northwestern Georgia. Johnston left it unguarded. Thomas wanted to go through there with the Army of the Cumberland, which would have put 65,000 men between Johnston and Atlanta. Sherman wouldn't do it. Sent McPherson with 24,000. And they forced Johnston to evacuate Dalton. But if Thomas had gotten through there, I think they would have trapped Johnston. They had another chance about 2 weeks later near Cartersville, Cassville, to get around behind Johnston. But the real example doesn't involve Thomas. Was at Bentonville at the very end of the war. Johnston's had one bridge over a swollen creek by which his army could have escaped. A force of Sherman's army was within a couple of hundred yards of that bridge and going for it under a really good corps commander named Joseph Mauer, much neglected man. Sherman ordered him back. Said, we got to join our other forces over in the eastern part of the state. Would have wiped out Johnston's army. Sherman didn't, as I said earlier, didn't have the killer instinct. But I've gotten off the track. You were asking about McPherson.
That's okay. That's good. That's good. No, this is great stuff. And talk to me just about in the scope of being a general. I mean, it's just, it feels like you have to really thread the needle in how conservative and how defensive do we want to be. And it seems like Joe Johnston was very heavily on that side. We have to maintain our army. We have to, if we have to give up land, so be it. But we have to keep this army functioning and keep the defense up as best as we can to a certain degree. And then you have people who you say, let's just all-out war. Let's just go, send them, and just try to just destroy them and break them, like the killer instinct you mentioned. How does a general, is that all learned at schooling, going back to schools like West Point and that kind of thing? Or is it something they just have to learn from their...
Well, the thing that should be beaten into every general's head is The government makes the policy. The president decides what we're trying to do. The prime minister, the civilian head of government. And Johnston probably at some intellectual level knew that, but he could not bring himself to work within that framework. In that sense, he was like Douglas MacArthur in Korea. Harry Truman made the decision. We will not cross the Yalu River. We will not get into World War III. And MacArthur wanted to cross the Yalu, wipe out all these people. And he couldn't get it through his head that he didn't make that decision. The president made that decision. He, MacArthur, would carry it out. And Davis and Johnston ran into that. Johnston could not see that some questions are so big that they transcend the army commander. They transcend the general. They involve things like geopolitics, logistics, public opinion. You've got to have civilians. And he, in effect, said, we have to have the army. Jefferson Davis said, we have got to preserve Alabama and Mississippi.
Let's talk about that some more. So you mentioned public opinion. Talk to me just, a lot of this is wilderness. There are some citizens, there's some, I guess you'd say homesteaders and that kind of thing. But just overall, it seems like it's a night and day difference for a lot of people, in the north and even, further out west compared to down here where it's every day you look outside, there's possibly a battle or an army coming to just, take all your stuff and, burn down your house possibly. So, talk to me about that, just public opinion in the South, how it changes over the war.
Well, you got to start with the realization that a very high percentage of people in the South were opposed to the Confederacy. They did not want to secede. Once secession came, the majority of white people probably would have supported it. But as the war went on and conditions became harder and harder, that number tended to shrink. People who were in areas that were not invaded tended to remain highly loyal. People who suffered often became more concerned. You can read letters, women trying to get food for their children, write their husbands. I don't remember the details, but there is a tear-jerking letter from a woman to her husband. I believe it's quoted in Wiley's book near the end, in which she writes. I look in the last part there about women and see if there's something maybe in the index. But it's, I was awakened by your daughter. She was crying. She said, Mommy, I'm hungry. I have no food for her. If you don't come home, she will die. What are you going to do? You're in the trenches and you get a letter like that. We know about that because they caught him for desertion.
Right. And man, that's heavy. That makes sense though, that like places that were kind of, isolated and protected from the war and didn't see the full effect of it, they're just like, yeah, just keep fighting. Yeah, we got to and they're very stay loyal, and then everybody else is just like, this is literally, sometimes directly and indirectly, killing us.
Well, the South could not fight a long war. If they didn't win fairly quickly, they were going to lose. It's like Germany in World War I. We got to win quickly or we will lose. Robert E. Lee was conscious of this. And I think it's one of the things that a lot of Confederates never understood. Just like Joe Johnston never understood. We can't give up certain places. We have to spend our resources to hold Richmond, to hold Vicksburg, to hold Atlanta. And Johnston, evacuate the cities, save the armies. But without the cities, without the food, without the ammunition, with Union armies marching everywhere, you're not going to have the Confederacy exist.
We mentioned Gone with the Wind earlier. That scene after the intermission where they're at Tara and they have, the Union soldiers that come in and try to, steal their food or whatever their intentions are. How real is that scene? Is that embellished in the Southern perspective? Because, I know you mentioned with Sherman, people are like, he burned down everything. Now come look at this house that was built before the war, like that kind of thing. How much of that's embellished?
Very much. It's the myth of the lost cause. That, Sherman, he sometimes where they went, they destroyed a lot. Much of it of military value. But Sherman wrote in his memoirs that we destroyed $100 million worth of property, which meant he would have destroyed about a third of all the property other than slave and land property in Georgia. And he only marched through about 12% of Georgia. And some of it was very poor. It just, in a way it's funny, but in a way it's tragic that they did this. It's the kind of thing that people like to hear. The Germans after World War I, we were stabbed in the back. The Jews, the communists are all responsible. And the truth is the German generals lost World War I. And I'm convinced that to a large extent, the Confederate government lost the Civil War for the Confederacy, following bad policies, not acting in the case of Polk and things like that.
Yeah. Talk about conscription. And Pickett's Mill and Dallas and New Hope, they happened in 64, right? That's right, because that's your book, Atlanta 1864. So talk to me, this might be multiple questions on one, I'm sorry. You mentioned that the South had to win early. In a perfect world, if they were going to win, how soon did they have to win? 2 years, 1 year, a couple months?
The sooner the better. I don't think you can put a time limit on it like that. I said they had to win soon. Obviously, if they could have held out for 12 years, they would have worn the North down. You think about it, a short-term war, an intermediate war, and a long-term war. They should have, if to win in the long term, which is what a lot of people think they should have done, they had to get through the intermediate term. But they were losing in the intermediate term. And if they didn't win in the short term, they would lose in the intermediate term and never get to the long term. That's why I think if you want to understand the war, you need to look out at the war in this part of the country, not Virginia, because this is where the Confederacy lost the war.
Why was Atlanta so important? What's the big deal about Atlanta at this time?
Railroads. The Confederacy had 3 rail routes from the east to the west. Only one was complete. That was one they lost in 1862 when Grant came up the Tennessee River. The second ran through Atlanta, Montgomery, Mobile, but it was not complete. There was no railroad across Mobile Bay. There were different gauges of track. The third ran through Columbus, Montgomery, and Mobile. So Atlanta is the second of those east-west rail lines. It was a major industrial center. It was a major center of government offices, hospitals, administrative offices. It was the key to the Confederate heartland, which is a sort of a rectangular area from Columbia, South Carolina to Jackson or Meridian, Mississippi. Federal Army got into that, the Confederacy was doomed, which is why Johnston's campaign was a geopolitical, logistical disaster. It was important as a symbol. You know, one by one, these other reasons disappeared. Sherman cut the rail line in mid-July, so it was no longer important as a transportation center. The businesses fled. The government offices fled. And by the time Johnston was removed from command on July 17th, Atlanta was important as a symbol for nothing else.
When that decision's finally made and Johnston is relieved of command and Hood's put in place, tell me what happens to Johnston after this? I mean, is he given a political appointment somewhere else? Or just like, hey, go shine the shoes in the barracks or something? What happens to Johnston? And talk to me about Hood gearing up and getting ready to make the last, make the final stand, I guess.
Okay, Johnston left the Army on July 18th and went to Macon. He lived in Macon and for a couple of 3 months down there, writing his report and fuming against Jefferson Davis and getting angrier and angrier about his treatment by Davis. Then he left, he and his wife, they went to Columbia, South Carolina. And after Sherman started for Columbia, they went to Lincolnton, North Carolina. And they were in North Carolina in February of 1865 when Johnston was recalled to duty. Went back in command of the Army for about 2 months in 1865. Excuse me.
Okay. You like a drink of water?
I got it right here.
Okay.
Went back in command of the Army, but was not able to do anything. Finally gave up in April. After the war, he worked as an express company, sort of like UPS. He worked in railroads, in the insurance business, lived in Selma, Alabama, Savannah, Richmond, got elected to Congress for 1 term, was a commissioner of railroads for the federal government, and work that ultimately led to the Interstate Commerce Act. Spent most of his time hating Jefferson Davis and writing about how dumb Jefferson Davis was and how unfairly Jefferson Davis had treated Joe Johnston, and died in 1891, still hating Jefferson Davis.
Gotcha. So talk to me about, and I think Johnston's a good example of this, talk to me about how important it was for these guys post-war to have their memoirs come out, or their recollections of the war, saying, and it seems like every one of them, they'd publish one, and it'd be like, well, this is really how it was. This is the last, the last book you need to read about the Civil War. This is exactly how it happened, and everything I said is true, 100%. I didn't embellish anything. Talk to me about that.
That's basically describing their memoirs, yes. Johnston was he had to show that he was right. and that he was a great general. And he wrote a book and a series of magazine articles to show he was right and Jefferson Davis was wrong. Sherman did the same thing. Grant wrote memoirs that are probably the best of any Civil War generals. A lot of them are, as you say, argumentative, that they were right. Anybody who criticized them was wrong. Some of them are largely fictitious. John B. Gordon's, for example. Interestingly enough, Robert E. Lee did not write his memoirs. George Thomas did not, which I ascribe to their credit, that neither one of them felt the need to do that. Old money doesn't need to justify itself. New money does, that we talked about earlier. All the generals' memoirs have to be taken with a huge grain of salt. Cum grano magno salis, as Bell Wiley used to say.
Thomas's nickname. Can you talk to me about that? You mentioned the battle, but talk to me about how he got his nickname.
You mean Old Slow Trot?
Well, not that one. I was thinking about, he's Rock of Chickamauga, isn't he?
Yeah.
So you might talk to me about that.
Well, he commanded the left end of the Union line at Chickamauga, and on September 20th, a mistake on the part of the Union commander, not Thomas, William Rosecrans, created a gap in the Union Army just as the Confederates launched an attack right at that gap. They didn't know it was there, but when they got there, there it was. So they went through it, and it routed the half of the Union Army, and they fled back to Chattanooga. Thomas pulled part of his army, his force back, formed a position along a ridge line, and they held off the Confederates until dark, so that the Confederates were not able to exploit their breakthrough, and hence the Rock of Chickamauga.
So basically his namesake comes from preventing the Confederates exploiting all of that and basically destroying their army.
Yeah.
First question I got for you on this run is, talk to me about conscription. Talk to me about, we talked about, you have all these things going on in this theater of the war. Talk to me about somebody who, early war they weren't a part of it, but all of a sudden they get, I'm assuming, a letter in the, or however they get it, the summons that you are to report for duty here and here. This is your commander. How did that work?
Well, they'd had conscription before, but it had been at a state level. This is national conscription that we're talking about. The requirement was essentially not all that different from what you have now, or had back when we had the military draft, in which a state would be given a quota. And if it could fill the quota by volunteers, that was fine. If they could not fill it by volunteers, they had to draft men out of the state militia. Men from 18 to 35 by law were members of the militia. So they had all these people that the 18 to 35 year olds. Some of the northern states, interestingly, realized if they could get black men from the South, they could apply them to their quotas and they wouldn't have to draft white men. So you have a lot of recruiting agents from the North going into the Union-occupied areas to recruit black men to satisfy the state's quota. They had occupational exemptions, railroad people, because railroads were so important. newspaper editors, important because of public opinion. The government had to have some way to communicate with the public, and that was the only way at that time. Mail carriers. I actually came across a case where the Confederate post office advertised for bids for people who wanted to carry the mail. The winning bid was from a guy who agreed to carry the mail and pay the government. He would not be paid for carrying the mail, but he would be exempt from conscription. They had substitution, by which if you were drafted, you could hire a substitute from men who were not drafted. They had commutation, whereby if you were drafted, you could pay a certain amount of money and wouldn't have to go. Both of these are ancient practices, but they gave it a rich man's war, poor man's fight kind of look. And as I mentioned earlier, it became increasingly hard, particularly in the South during the war, to conscript men. Eventually the Conscription Bureau in the Confederate War Department said, we can't find any more people to conscript. And you have those letters like the one I mentioned earlier, if you do not come home, your daughter will die. So conscription was not popular, but both sides resorted to it. And you know, I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Talk to me, and this is on the same kind of topic, kind of. Starting off with the war, you know, they're sitting there, you're saying, you know, we're all about states' rights. But talk to me about the process and just the overall public opinion of the Confederacy kind of cannibalizing itself, realizing, oh, we have to have a strong, you know, maybe not federal, maybe that's not the right word for it. They see themselves understanding that we can't just be a Confederacy, we have to adopt a lot of the same practices that the actual country uses of keeping all of us, you know, herded together and having to, you know, find the men and having that strong federal kind of point of view to be able to actually enforce conscription.
Well, this is a dilemma that the Confederates were in. They wanted to wage a war against well, they didn't want to, but they had to wage a war against a much stronger opponent. But to do that, they had to alter the very foundation of their belief, which was state rights. And a lot of these Confederates could not make that transition, and they became opponents of the Confederate government. Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and people like that became Confederate nationalists, and therefore they tended to look at it as a national matter. But others like Joe Brown, who was the governor of Georgia, were extreme state rights people. They could not adjust to it. Brown was a disputatious kind of guy. One of these people who wanted to argue about everything. And he did. Alexander Stephens, the vice president, was also that way. And they never made that adjustment to being a nationalist as opposed to a Georgian or a North Carolinian or an Arkansan. It was the dilemma they never. This is one reason why the Confederacy could not stand a long war. You know, then almost from the first, they begin to go that way. And you can find as early as late 1861 in some states where this is beginning to get that way, particularly in Arkansas, where all kinds of problems coming up, including smallpox and starvation. And if they don't win the war quickly, it's going to they're not going to make it. And to win it quickly, they had to have a strong national government, which was one of the things they were revolting against.
So it seems like in a way they were a victim of their own device. And going back to what you're talking about with, the lack of quality of generals in the Confederate theater here, they're all stuck with one another, and that's a problem because they're running out of time and they're all bickering with one another while the federal forces are just coming in unified for the most part.
Well, they were divided too, but they didn't have the pressure. You didn't have Confederate armies marching around in New York and Michigan and Minnesota and places like that. They didn't have the pressure. So you don't have the governor of Rhode Island telegraphing Lincoln, "We're being threatened by a Confederate army." But you had the governor of Georgia telegraphing Jefferson Davis, "We're being threatened by Sherman's army. Get some people down here to help us." And I don't have any people. Well, you got to get them down here or we'll be lost. They don't have that pressure. They also had the enormous advantage of Lincoln. Lincoln's ability to get people to work together, his ability to communicate with people, to win the loyalty. Jefferson Davis did not have that kind of personality. And as I say, that's a major difference right there.
Is the genius behind Lincoln what you just mentioned? There's that one book that's famous, I think it's called Team of Rivals. Was that Lincoln's genius that he was just like, I'm going to get everybody who doesn't like me, basically, and disagrees with me, and even though they might not disagree, maybe they don't agree with me, but they're geniuses in their own right, and I have to have them if we're going to win this war?
Well, he realized that he had to get support from all the people. His Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and his Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, were Democrats. Another political genius who was the same way was Franklin Roosevelt. His Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, was a Republican. His Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, was a Republican. So both of them take the two of the three most important departments of government, the third being Treasury. But they take two of the three most important parts of the government and put them under guys from the other political party. That's what you're talking about. And that Team of Rivals is a very good book. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote it.
Talk to me, I know we've kind of mentioned him briefly, the governor of Georgia, is it Joe Brown? Talk to me about his perspective on all this.
He was sort of like Joseph E. Johnston. He was not somebody from the traditional old line aristocracy. He wasn't even from the new aristocracy. He was a really scheming politician, could advocate different things. As I say, he was one of these disputatious people. I'm trying to think of somebody in the more modern period who would be like him. I can think of some people personally who were like that, but I can't think of anybody in political office. But he was more interested in getting into public office. In a sense, he was like George Wallace. Somebody once asked, was George Wallace, the true George Wallace, the man who stood in the schoolhouse door, or was he the man who apologized on his deathbed for segregation and racism? Which was the real George Wallace? I'm the only one who knows the answer. They were both the real George Wallace, whichever would get him more votes. And if he could play on this side or that side, he would go with whichever one he thought would be most popular. Joe Brown was very short-sighted. He was an extreme secessionist. He then became an obstacle to Confederate independence. After the war, he became a Republican. Then after the Republicans got kicked out, he became a Democrat. Just, whatever it takes. A chameleon would probably be the
Sounds like
best.
he's a professional politician. Just
I mean, a professional, yeah, a synonym for chameleon.
Gotcha. Populism at its finest.
Yeah, I have problems with that word populism because I think of the populist movement with a capital P in the 1890s.
In the grand scheme of the entire Civil War, just everything you've studied over the years and written about, what's something that people just do not appreciate enough? It could be a person, it could be a thing, a battle, something that maybe it's an underrated topic or under-researched topic, something that you've just found in your years looking at it that you're like, wow, why does nobody talk about this?
I would really have to think about that. I can't come up with anything right offhand. But I think if you look back at the writing about Civil War history, that one of the things that strikes me most about it, and this goes back to what we started with, was the point that Bell Wiley made, that you really need to appreciate the common people. You talk about the generals, you talk about the politicians, you talk about the big businessmen, the diplomats, but you really need to appreciate the average person. And if you approach it that way, you can get a much better perspective on what the war meant. And I think that probably holds true for every period of history. But it's in the Civil War where you have a literate population and hundreds of thousands of people away from home, writing letters, keeping diaries. Remember, they were lucky. They didn't have television. They didn't have computers. They had to read and write and think and all these wonderful things that we no longer do. And you can get an insight to them. I suspect that it's a lot like people in the War for Independence or in later wars where you had censors watching the mail and it was violation of regulations to keep a diary. And you can't get that view into the people. But that's the one thing that I think might fit best into what you're talking about. I can't think of a specific thing other than that right now.
I think that was I think that's a great sentiment because, I mean, we get so enthralled, like you mentioned, we started with Lee, with Grant, with Sherman, with all these big names that we've heard through the echoes of history, but we don't ever really think about the average farmer who, would see this happen and would have to, leave town and look after their family. I mean, that's just something that, I think that speaks volumes.
You mentioned that, an idea just popped in my head, which is one there's been a great deal of writing on, but that's the women. They had to take over the farm, the business, the plantation, and supervise it, do the work, plow the fields, harvest the crops, feed the kids, teach the schools. That's something incredible too. Johnny Reb and Mrs. Reb, Billy Yank and Mrs. Yank. They're the four of them, not the two.
I just want to do a couple more questions. I know we're almost done here, but this is just kind of just random questions. I'm not going to go into the guns of the Confederacy or guns of the South Territory, but I just want to talk. It was something I wanted to talk about earlier. And this is a what-if question. And it's just something just you and I just talking. If the Confederacy won, let's say they won and they have, they've seceded, Davis would be the sitting president of the Confederate States of America.
Until 1867.
Is that when he died, or is that?
No, the Confederate president had a 6-year term of office, could not be reelected.
Gotcha. I think, is it pretty safe to say that Lee would have probably become the next one?
Unless he said no.
Do you think he would have said no? I mean, what do you think?
I think he would have, although he would have made an excellent president. He was a better politician than Davis. Joe Johnston was a bad politician.
And talk to me about that. I mean, like you mentioned Johnston earlier. So he ran and successfully won a congressional seat. And
Well, he didn't exactly win. A bunch of people nominated him. He didn't want to make political speeches. He was a Confederate general. He was very popular with people, and he didn't want to run for re-election.
Staying in politics and with these Confederate generals and these Union generals, I guess afterwards, just talk to me about the political ramifications of that. Once we get to Reconstruction, you know, Georgia, I believe, it just becomes a Republican-led state.
A Democratic-led state.
Sorry.
Really, it became, it transitioned away from the Democratic Party in modern 20th century politics. Really probably began seriously in 1948 with the Dixiecrat movement. And it was gradual after that. You know, the battle over segregation, the Goldwater candidacy, the movement of the Democratic Party more to the left, the increasing influence of blacks in the Democratic Party, the movement of blacks from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party, which took place beginning in the 1930s, is, you know, kind of a precursor to that. If you've got Republicans and blacks over here and Democrats over here, and gradually there's this sort of transition like that. I would date it before Purdue.
What happens when it comes to just the African American population? Like, what happens?
Well, that was a big question that had not really been thought about. A lot of the abolitionists would have said, do away with slavery and that's it, neglecting the fact that you have millions of people, most of whom have no education, they're illiterate, they know nothing about the world economy, they have no property. The people who were running Reconstruction, the radical Republicans, tended to think in terms of, we need to make sure they have civil rights, you know, that they can eat in restaurants, stay in hotels. They didn't have the money to eat in restaurants. They didn't have the money to stay in hotels. They needed education. They needed property. They needed some kind of transition. Lincoln actually seems to have been moving in that direction. And I think the death of Lincoln is probably the greatest tragedy in American history. I don't think he would have done a lot of the things, or he wouldn't have done them in the same way. You know, the radical Republicans would say to Alabama, let's say, you cannot have representation in Congress until you ratify the 15th Amendment. Either Alabama is a state or it is not. If it's a state, it has representation and can decide whether to ratify the 15th Amendment. If it's not a state, it's got no business ratifying the 15th Amendment. Lincoln would never have done that. It contradicts common sense. And if Lincoln had anything, it was common sense.
Anything else you want to add?
No, I thank you. I've enjoyed it.
It's been amazing.